Hi all, the World Chess Championship Candidates Tournament has started. This is a double round robin to determine Magnus Carlsen's challenger in November. It runs from March 13th, which is today, of this day I'm doing this video, to March 31st. So the all-star participants include Vishy Anand, former world champion, Kramnik, Andreikin, Topalov, Mamedyarov, Aronian, Karjakin and Svidler. Now, the game I'd like to show you is Vishy Anand against Levon Aronian. Levon Aronian is currently ranked 2 in the world. Vishy is around 8 at the moment on the FIDE world ranking list. And Levon Aronian was the theoretical candidate, player in most people's determination to have the best chance of winning this candidates tournament. So let's see what happened in round 1. So e4 from Vishy Anand playing white, and we see Levon playing e5. Classical Roy Lopez, bishop b5, a6. After bishop a4, knight f6. White castled, bishop e7. It's a pretty trodden path here. So far, rook e1, b5, bishop drops back. Black castles, all pretty common. h3. Bishop b7, and now Vishy chooses d3, which helps blot out the bishop for a moment on b7. This structure is against this bishop on b7 generally. Black now played a very interesting move. Usually black is content to play d6. I mean, that's the most common move. Levon played actually d5, which is also common but a bit rarer. It has now the idea of a pawn sacrifice, so white can actually take this pawn here, but Vishy delays that. The usual move is just to take the pawn immediately. For example, knight takes, knight d4, and the game can continue like this, and there's been a few games from this position, and I think it's meant to be about equal. But Vishy delayed taking on e5. He actually played knight bd2. And now the usual move is actually f6. 17 games in my life book with that. Or knight f4, 8 games. This next move has been not very much seen before, I believe. Queen d7. Okay, so it's maintaining that gambit of that pawn. I mean, a move like f6, of course, would support the pawn. And you might think, well, why can't black do that? What would white have done here, just out of interest? Well, maybe c4 has been seen before, and this position is okay. It looks to be theoretically okay for white. Okay, so Levon, by sacking the pawn, is trying to get much more piece pressure than the f6 line. So after rook takes e5, okay, what is the justification for being a pawn down? And it's a centre pawn. Well, this bishop is roaring now on the diagonal. Very active, nice bishop. Both bishops could actually work together on these two diagonals, potentially. So it looks quite aggressive. An aggressive way to start the tournament with this kind of gambit. So rook a e8, knight f3. After bishop d6, bishop e3. Technically, the engines are crying out for a move here, knight d5, which is interesting to consider. What would white actually be doing here? Does white want to give up the dark square bishop? If white plays bishop d2, an exchange of rooks. Okay, let's go with knight takes e1. It looks as though this might be okay for white. It looks a bit on the scary side though, the black bishops and the knight on d5, a little bit on the scary side. And it's interesting knight d5 wasn't chosen, but instead Levon chooses rook just at e7 to double up rooks, which looks fairly sensible as well. Now we see d4, and okay, here rook f e8 carrying on doubling, c3 making d4 quite strong, h6. And now maybe this wasn't estimated that well. When you give up material and you get some sort of piece play or piece pressure, the opponent does always have the chance to do a counter gambit at some point, and here actually Vishy plays a counter gambit which robs black of the dangerous bishop pair. One thing which I think computers don't really understand as well intuitively as humans is that the bishop pair together compensate for each other's weaknesses. They're great partners in crime on the light and dark squares. So if sometimes you can get rid of the bishop pair, you're blinding your opponent's bishops on like the dark squares if you got rid of that one, or the light squares. So it's sometimes good to get rid of the bishop pair. And here we see a counter sacrifice, knight e5, just giving a pawn back, and technically it guarantees white a small advantage. I think it is a very, very good move. If the knight's tolerated, I think this is, if say queen f5, then actually bishop c2, and we can actually support this knight, and it will be quite a pain, that knight, to get rid of. If for example knight d5 for f6, then queen d3, there's going to be technical issues to try and get rid of this knight. f6 is not going to be pliable. So it's difficult. This counter sack, it's difficult to see what black does, except for take on e5 and lose that precious bishop pair. If we consider if white wanted to keep material, a4 looks like a kind of Marshall Gambit type position where you play a4 in a way, and white's usually trying to get the a file working. But here leaving the black bishop pair looks like a dangerous proposition, for example like this. So I think that is very, very interesting that this kind of position was rejected, that Vishy just simplified peacefully to play knight e5 and get rid of the dark square bishop. So he's a pawn up, he can afford to do that. So bishop takes e5, takes, rook takes e5, and now the queens come off, and when the queens come off, the potential for a vicious kingside attack is also sometimes reduced. So the situation here is actually that white has a nice bishop pair, and black the bishop and knight. The structure here puts the brakes on b4, and it looks as though a4 will be logical to try and fracture black's pawn structure in theory. But I think a4 here might run into something like knight c5. Let's have a quick check of a4. Knight c5 makes this maybe not so tempting to play a4 immediately in this position. Instead we see centralizing move rook ed1, and here if knight c5, in fact that knight could be snapped off. If this didn't happen in the game, knight f6 was played, but if knight c5 was played, then I think bishop takes c5, and it's same colour bishops right now, that's an important note, and white's d file looks good for rook d7. And I think this would be slightly unpleasant for black, and certainly all the fun promised of earlier with the gambit has now disappeared with white being slightly better. So Levon, he doesn't want that, he plays knight f6, but now there's another way of trying to introduce some structural damage to these pawns. It's either a4 or c4. a4 though might run into bishop d5, challenging this loose piece, and that could be quite annoying. If bishop takes, knight takes, what has this achieved? Because there's pressure on the e file, there's pressure on e3. I don't think this is anything to write home about for white. This particular position, black looks okay there and controls the e file quite well. So I think c4 is a nice way to try and isolate pawns. If you can start isolating pawns, then there's more routes to attack them usually, and they're without their fellow pawns to help protect them. So the idea is to play this isolation game. So c6, now rook ac1. Okay, rook drops back, and now we see a4, trying to leave just one pawn for black on b5 would be a useful target for things like rook c5 later. Black now plays b takes c4, so we see structural damage, two isolated pawns. After bishop takes c4, eyeing a6 immediately, and also if white's given time, a rook on, say, like this is not totally outrageous to try and attack these pawns later. So we see knight d5, putting pressure on the bishop attacks the rook, we see rook e4. This rook is now evictable on e4 with f3. If black had a dark square bishop, maybe there'd be more cause for concern, but at the moment these bishops beautifully lock out the rooks on quite a few squares. Rook drops to e5, and now the king steps in with king f2 to help control that e2 square, because black might have been intending something like knight f4 with e2 being a fun square to use. But here, if knight f4 in this position, just rook d7 actually, and actually f7. So this light square bishop is very good. This is not on because the bishop takes f7 check, and we win that rook if rook takes c5 there. So this is a bit passive, this position. If bishop c8, I mean, if rook f8 here, then we can just take that rook. There's not really much to do about f7. If the knight went back here, well, we lose the bishop. So, okay, so that knight can't really step into f4. So this d-file pressure is very, very useful for f7. I mean, that's what we can determine from some of these variations. Black played bishop c8, trying to control that d7 square entry point. And now, actually, Vishy dropped the bishop back to f1. And we could ask the same question here. What happens if knight f4? Well, what is black actually threatening if knight f4? Probably not much now. White can actually also just play bishop d6, and there's no problem with e2. So again, this position is actually quite passive for black, with fractured pawns to look after. We see rook 5 to e6. b4 looks tempting, looks tempting to try and fix both of them, but actually another tempting idea, rook d3, introduces the possibility of rook b3 and working on that b file. There's no pawn for black on the b file, so that's weaker than it was before with a pawn there. So knight f4, and now the rook switches in, so it's got potential entry points now. b8, b4, or b6 potentially. b8 would be nice tactically to create some pin. b4 to evict the knight. These could all be useful points of usage on that b file. Black played now rook d8. I guess Levon couldn't have been that pleased with the position here. Black is threatening now rook d2 check, but now bishop drops back and attacks the knight and protects d2. Knight d5. Now this isn't an invitation for a draw. Well, if it is, it's rejected. If bishop c5, I guess black could continue with this and ask again what would happen, but no, Vishy drops the bishop quite adequately to d2 to keep the knight out of f4. And this phase is very interesting to see this knight. Can it actually be a problem in this position? It looks at the moment that black already has issues to face with, and the knight seems to be holding black together, stopping the entry point on b6 to try and exploit these isolated pawns. The knight, though, in this position at move 34, played knight f6. This might be a slight inaccuracy. Engine suggestion here is rather odd looking bishop d7, giving up a6, rather dramatic. What would this do? Well, rook a8, and then black could, basically, that's a dissolving operation to at least remove the isolated pawn if that's taken, and this should be nearly okay for black, but white still has that bishop pair and can actually get rid of a pair of rooks here by force. It's still pleasant for white, but to think bishop d7 is necessary here as a temporary pawn sack, it shows that black has difficulties. So knight f6 attacks that bishop again. So where does the bishop go without being continually harassed? Well, it goes to a5 with tempo, not just protecting d2 but now attacking that rook. The rook moves to e8, and now finally we land this rook b6. The knight's neglected its duty, so these isolated pawns are now being victimized. Rook e5 hitting the bishop drops back hitting the rook, and now instead of moving the rook, well, this doesn't look good. If the rook's moved, we're going to lose a6 here potentially, or first I think actually bishop takes a6 here. There's a problem with e2. We can't do this. I think that it's not that good because I think there's some infiltration issues with rook e2 check. No, what we could do here as white, is bishop takes f6, and then if say g takes, then we can consider just taking a pawn like on c6. But Levon reacted here with instead knight d5, and we're simplifying into a clearer endgame position now with this, with two rooks coming off. And this is a very interesting start point or end point depending on your calculations. It looks as though, isn't white in trouble? Two pieces, well, the pawn if you is loose, and the bishop on e5. Is this Levon Aronian's end point for analysis, or could it be the opponent's start point for analysis? Computers see much further than humans, and here, fantastically powerful move is played by Vishy Anand. And if I give you 20 seconds, or rather 10 seconds, pardon me, or you might want to pause the video, can you guess what white played here and the strategic motive associated with it? So 10 seconds starting from now. What would you play as white? Okay, white plays bishop d4, and the strategic motive all of a sudden has become about dominating this knight. If it really is going to take on a4, that might not be technically the best move to take on a4, because the knight looks to be stranded there. If knight d5, well, there's still rook takes c6. This is not most enjoyable position to have with black, with white having the bishop pair, has lost the pawn, and a6 under great scrutiny as well, and about to be fixed down with a5. If say rook d8, then a5, fixing that pawn, and these pawns are becoming even more menacing. So Levon actually broke the beginner's rule, knight on the rim is dim, by taking on a4. Is the exception here taking that pawn? Well, the knight's not going anywhere after rook takes c6. The knight is stranded at the moment. b6 is cut off, c5, c3 and b2. It's this bishop which is the prison guard of the knight, and that's attacked with rook d8. But now white just plays rook c4, and the knight's life is threatened. It has to be protected. And now b3. Black hasn't got too many moves to avoid just losing a piece here. Bishop b5. But now rook b4. The knight is still completely stranded here. If bishop takes f1, we just remain with that knight stranded, clearly. Levon tried knight b2, which introduces a tactical trick. If bishop takes b2, then we have rook d2 check, getting the piece back. But Vishy has options here. He takes on b5, simplifying further. A takes. Now you might think, is the knight still stranded in its new location? It's got d3, it's got d1, you might say. Well, king e3 extinguishes d3. And now the knight is really in big trouble. Rook e8 check is tried. I don't think there's anything better. If knight d1 check, then in this position I think some accuracy is needed here to play king e2. One has to be careful here. If king d2, then maybe knight f2 using that pin. Oh. And then the knight can be quite annoying here to play to h1. And probably it's not good, but it's getting out here. It's escaping. It's made a run for it. It's difficult to actually win this knight because the king's having to nanny the bishop here. But white is still technically better here. But this can all be avoided, this knight running issue, with just in this position, if knight d1 check was played, just with king e2, just making sure the king is guarding f2. There's no pin to make use of. So that would have been the end of the knight there. Instead, we have the check here, king d2, Now rook d8. And there's one little trick in this position. This is the final move now, apparently, according to ChessBase anyway. The final move here at move 47 is played. How would you try and win this knight if I give you 10 seconds here? So you can either win 200 points or lose 200 points with this final move guess. How to win the knight. If I give you 10 seconds, you might want to pause the video. Okay, if you said king c2, you lose 200 points because of knight c4. Important tactic to bear in mind, interrupting the protection of the bishop. White might still be theoretically okay, but the knight has successfully escaped. Because if you take, then rook takes d4. No, instead, Vishy just plays king c3. And now, where's the knight going? After knight's black resigned, if knight d1 check, king c2, where's the knight going now? The bishop dominates the knight on e3 and f2. Everything's covered here. The knight is going to be eliminated. Where else can the knight go? Knight c4. The king's protecting d4. We can just take it. A bit of a disastrous first round for Levon Aronian. This is the only decisive game of the tournament so far. So we're in for some mega exciting games, I believe. And I'm going to try and pick off the more exciting ones soon after they're played. I think, yeah, that was a very, very interesting performance, and it shows Vishy Anand has got the power still to beat the number 2 in the world on the FIDE rating list. He could be a strong challenger for Magnus Carlsen to get revenge if he keeps going like this. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.